Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation, and thank you everyone for joining to this second session. So I thought differently as last time, I will try to speak a bit freely, and also if you want to intervene at any point, especially when we get to the section about Hegel, please feel free to do so. So what I'm gonna talk about today is kind of related to the first talk. So for those of you who haven't been here, I'm gonna try to repeat some things, but I hope that doesn't become boring for the other ones. And also, like what I'm talk about today is kind of an experiment of trying to bring together two ideas that I have in different contexts. So on the one hand, I've been thinking about the concept of utopia, but more in relation to Bloch's reading, so Ernst Bloch reading of Hegel. And then on the other hand, this question of, and then in that context, so the Bloch's reading of Hegel, it's a lot about precisely the location of ideality and materiality, and how Bloch reads then what is the concept of ideality in Hegel. And then on the other hand, so this concept of universality, locality that I talked about last time, which is more related to the idea of the organic condition of bodies. And what I'm trying to do is to bring those two questions or two problems together. And recently I've read the Uncomputable from Alexander Galloway, and then I thought I found the kind of a suggestive question that Galloway posits there to think through these two problems together. So this is the origin of this idea of absolute difference. So in a sense, it's kind of, I'm trying to posit a problem. So let's see if, so I have to be honest, I don't have the answer, but I want to be able to posit the problem in a right way. And I want to start with a quote by Ursula Le Guin, because this is kind of the core of my thinking about utopia in relation to Bloch. And I think they are not thinking of very far away concepts of utopia. So I will just start reading the quote. Utopia is a place that does not exist, ensuring that the way to get there is by the way that is not a way. And in the same vein, the nature of the utopia I'm trying to describe is such that if it is to come, it must exist already. So this is kind of the core of the problem. And the question is, so how can we think about what is not yet? So if it does not exist, and how can we move toward that which is not here yet? If something is now the case, it should have been possible for it either to be or not to be. So how are we to think of this space of possibility before the factual? One of the paradoxical characteristics of thinking about utopia is that it seems to be something that in order for it to be, it must not be. Utopia is that which is to be achieved, that which must come. In this sense, on the one hand, utopia is conceived as that which is beyond the present state of things. But if utopia becomes, then it will no longer be utopia, but rather the present state of things. If this is the case, then how can we distinguish between utopia and just the present state of things? On the other hand, if utopia must become possible, there must be something in the present that will develop into what should be. But if utopia must, at least in some sense, already be here, then we are back to the problem of how to distinguish it from simply being what is the case. And this is what it seems to be the paradoxical status of utopia. So I would like to look at this paradoxical status of utopia, or the paradox of utopia, by looking at the concept of difference that emerges from the relation and the gap between ideas of special politics and some ideas around unbounded subjectivity. And then I will turn to Hegel's notion of nature, where he characterizes nature as a contradiction between contingency and necessity. And I will try not to get much into the distinction between contingency and necessity in Hegel, but maybe we can do this in the discussion. One important thing for the context of this talk is that Hegel characterizes nature as a contradiction. But of course, Hegel characterizes many things as contradiction. The important thing about this particular kind of contradiction is that it's one that remains unresolved. So he has other concepts of contradictions, for example, the contradiction in the logic, and this is one that explicitly gets resolved. And I'm very interested in this unsolved status of nature. So since contradictions remains, on the one hand, so the reason for this contradiction to remain unsolved is that on the one hand is the kind of grounded in the concept or in the conceptual. We will talk about this later. And then on the other hand, we kind of always have contingencies coming from the natural realm. So this is kind of the core of the idea of the absolute difference. And I will explain that in a minute when we talk about Hegel's contradiction. And then the idea is to use this unsolved contradiction in nature, or the contradiction between contingency and necessity, to think about this politics of space, which we talked about last time a bit. So kind of how could we rethink the idea of spatiality, considering this idea of ideality and materiality in the contradiction of nature. So I hope we can unpack those things. And as I was saying, it's more about like trying to unpack things than having answers right away. So I'm not very used to use PowerPoint at the same time that I speak. So if I forget to shift the slides, please just let me know. So in this book, Uncomputable, is a 2021 book by Alexander Galloway. And as far as I know, the last book by Galloway, he revisits the genealogy of the digital by looking at various past technologies. So Galloway distinguished between the analog and the digital, where analog technologies are not just those developed before the emergence of digital computing. The genealogy of digital can be traced back to the history of different forms of machine vision and organization that are identified, for example, in chronophotography or in weaving technologies. Digital then is defined as that which implies an operation of differentiation. The analog, on the other hand, is characterized as a process of continuity. As the analog and the digital are not bounded to a particular technology, they are rather organizational forms that can be found in different technologies. So even those that usually we wouldn't say that are digital technologies, they may imply a digital process. In this context, Galloway refers to John von Neumann's electronic computer project at Princeton and the production of a bicycle wheel hard drive. Especially, it was a wheel with a magnetic wire that could send magnetic signals from the wire, signals that were then stored. This is described as a device that transforms analog technologies into digital. The analog is defined as continuity, since the movement of the wheel carried the magnetic wire, so that's the continued process. And then the digital is said to refer to the discontinuity, in this case, the discontinuity of the signals. The digital is understood as the field of discreteness or storage in the form of symbolic information. So this is one example of the many that Galloway gives in Uncomputable to address the transformation from the continuity of the analog to the discontinuous symbols of the digital. From these various instances of the genealogy of the digital, Galloway arrives at the following definition. The digital means that one has been divided into two, that something continuous has been differentiated. Thus the digital indicates two-ness, the making of the two, but also beyond the two to the three, the four, and the multiple. The digital means distinction or making discrete. The digital happens wherever separation and distinction from the essential substrate of the medium. So the digital names then the emergence of difference, as we can see in the quote. Difference is then defined as discreteness. By detaching digitality from meaning only digital computers, Galloway implies that the digital has been there as any process of differentiation can be traced back. And that's kind of the play with the title, The Long Digital Age. This conception of the digital and the analog implies a questioning of the idea that digital technologies create a dichotomy between the ways we inhabit analog and digital spaces. A bodies beyond the digital space do not need to be the analog, but depending on the organization, that may imply some form of digitality. Digital and analog become kind of two principles. the one and the many. So in the sense, there is kind of a digital thought of the genealogy of digitality. I think that this is what Galloway is doing in this book. One that is not really against the duality between these two principles, but it kind of shows that they are always translated from one to the other and failing to do so. And as I understand it, this kind of resonates in Galloway's previous work, and this book that I have here, the interface effect, where the interface was precisely defined as kind of an operation that fails to represent, and because of this failure, it works. So it works because it does not work. So I think that he's kind of translating this idea to the relation between digital and analog. The emergence of digital technologies goes hand in hand with a critique to the idea that the field of the immaterial is opposed to the materiality of political struggle. In Galloway's view, this is a consequence of Marx's concept of alienation and exchange value. This suspicion is then translated in the one against digital forms of social organization because they generate a new level of abstraction and detachment from the materiality of bodies. This kind of rejection of digital technologies can be seen in ecofeminist positions, where every kind of technology is seen as a continuation of the patriarchal project of technological and scientific progress. It is precisely such ideas of technology what is at the background of Galloway's critique. Such conceptions of technology will have to imply some version of essentialist naturalism, according to which nature will be the original state and technology an imposed modification. By separating from the original substrate, any form of technological intervention will have to detach from the material substrate it emerged from. So contrary to this position, Galloway claims, and here's the quote, the immaterial or spirit or the logos are not by necessity contrary to progressive political movements. Nevertheless, the lofty realm of rational idealism has always been something of a hindrance to those suffering from the harsh vicissitudes of material fact. And while the left has suffered at the hands of abstraction, it also has long pursued an agenda of utopian creativity and invention. Such a dynamic has fueled many of the debates in world history, those between traditionalism and transformation, between positivism and dialectics, or between social science and theory. So I'm interested in looking with detail to what kind of what is in this passage, what is called utopian creativity, and what ideas of utopia are implied in this dichotomy between the materiality of the social sciences and the political movements of what Galloway calls the left, and the ideality of theory against which it's supposed to, or which is supposed to be opposed to the materiality of the social struggle. Galloway then discusses an inherent conflict to the dichotomy between materiality and ideality that surrounded the leftist conception of utopia. And this is the quote, and I guess I missed this one, as I said. This is the quote that I was saying at the beginning, that it was kind of the provocation for me to think about these problems together. So the problem of utopia and Bloch's reading of Hegel, and then this idea of the materiality of bodies as supposedly opposed to ideas of universality. So I'm just gonna read it. One may say something similar about leftist cultural production in general. The left is forever true in the here and now, always in the grip of its own immediate suffering. But it will forever be defeated in the end, even if it finds vindication there. It is not that the past is always glorious and the future antiseptic. Quite the opposite. Both past and future are internally variated into alternately repressive and liberating moments. For the left, the historical present is one of immediate justice won through the raw facts of struggle and sacrifice. The historical present is always true and at the same time bloody. But the future, the utopian imagination, is a time of complete liberation, forged from the mold of the most profound injustice, meaning that utopia is always false, but forever at the same time free. So I think that this is like the core of the discussion. What conception of the idea and concept, and what concept of materiality may be required to rethink the nature of utopia? So I think that Galloway is kind of diagnosing this opposition from the left, or the kind of the impossibility of the left to think utopia, and and kind of in the sense that I was saying about the interface, so it kind of tries to go beyond utopia, but it kind of, every time that some realization of utopia happens, that shows also the impossibility to realize it. And that is kind of where the opposition between materiality and ideality doesn't help. So if you try to move toward utopia, you can always fail in a sense. In Galloway's observation of leftist ideas of justice, utopia is opposed to the present. Emancipatory movements work with the assumption that justice must be achieved on the present. Otherwise, acting for the immediate present will be meaningless. On the other hand, utopia is that which is to come, but therefore can only happen after the moment of liberation. Utopia is formed by injustice because its possibility depends on the present remaining unjust. Utopia is, in this account, the negative of the present. Galloway's critique to this opposition in what he calls the left is that it assumes a dichotomy between the materiality of the present, or what he calls bloody, and the ideality of the utopian moment, which can only remain utopian by not being realized. In a sense, keeping the actuality of utopia depends on the impossibility for achieving justice. And as he sees, the problem relies on the skepticism towards abstraction, logos, or the idea. Galloway then identifies in political movements inspired by or carried on the digital the possibility to overcome this duality, in what he called the politics of presence. And I think we talked about this last time, that a struggle that is not so much centered around the duality between materiality and the ideal, but on what he sees as the logic of presence and absence, or one who has the right to be and who does not. So in a sense, it is a politics of the digital, or guided by the principle of digitality. According to Galloway, the problem is with the kind of relation established between materiality and ideality. Although I'm not sure that he thinks that this is a problem. They are not mediated because mediation does not work. He then suggestively asks, and so the question comes again, always again, is the dialectic of a medium, or does the dialectic demonstrate the absolute impossibility of any kind of mediation whatsoever? What is the status of negation, of the obscure, of the dark corners of being that are rarely ever subsumed by dialectical becoming, or even strategically excluded from it? So the idea, kind of the idea in this quote, is that the negative is not an opposition to affirmation, but rather the field where the relation between being and its negation does not work. This question also suggests that there is something that is always left out of the mediation between ideality and materiality. So in order to understand how this looks like in Hegel, this is where I would like to look at how he thinks about ideality and nature. One important thing is that Hegel does not think that nature equals materiality. But anyways, I think this is important to understand what would be the negative that is left outside of the dialectical movement, like in Hegel. It is in this context where I got interested in ideas of teleology and the constraints in biology that we talked about last time, and how kind of this new interest in teleology is trying to reorganize the idea of the organism, and they're doing this by naturalizing teleology, so getting rid of the idea that for organisms to have aims, there should be some kind of metaphysical superentity that can be that can ground or that can give the aims beforehand, but rather like this idea of the organism having to give themselves constraints, and that these constraints are produced by the organism itself. And I talked about this book last time. So this is one of the biologists that are talking about this idea of constraints, and constraints being the product of the work of the organism that at the same time enables for more work to be done. And I'm interested in this perspective because I think that they're kind of reframing the question of what does it mean to speak of aims in the organism. And I'm trying to think of this as kind of rethinking the idea of the locality of ideality. So ideality is not something that is given by transcendence, as I was saying, by some metaphysical superentity, but rather like ideality is that towards which the organism strives, and it's given by the organism itself. So I won't go more into detail here, just so you keep in mind that that is kind of the idea of, or what I think that is Hegelian in this notion of constraints, is precisely this idea of there is kind of ideality is that what makes a system an autonomous system, because it depends on the organism itself. And so it's at the same time enabling, but it involves giving yourself constraints. And I think this is a deeply Hegelian lesson. But maybe so I will come back to this after looking at what Hegel says that happens in nature. And that's where I would like to go into some Hegel. I have to be honest and say that I made this translation. So I cannot assure that it's very good or that is accurate to the English version of the text. But I hope it's still understandable. So Hegel speaks of contradiction in 2 paragraphs of his philosophy of nature. And just for a very general context for those of you that are not very familiar with Hegel's philosophy, so one thing that is important in this context is to say that he understands his philosophical system as being composed by 3 parts. So the first one is the logic, the second one is the philosophy of nature, and the third one is the philosophy of spirit. I hope this is not a boring thing for many of you, but for me it's important in the context of the discussion of the contradiction, because the contradiction of nature appears in the philosophy of nature. And another thing that is important also is to say that Hegel never wrote a book called The Philosophy of Nature, but is part of this, of the publication of his lectures on the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences. So he actually wrote a book called The Logic, and then it was supposed to be continued by some philosophy of nature, but it never got there. So we only have, so to speak, Logic as a complete book. And then we have this 3-parted system and the Encyclopedia of Natural Science, of Philosophical Science. And the order of the section is important for being the development of the Hegelian system as an immanent one, which I think is important to do, or many of the problems I will talk about have to do with an immanent reading of the Hegelian system. Because the process of the dialectical process is different depending on the part of the system. So yeah, that's just for very general context. And as I was saying, the idea of nature as contradiction appears in his philosophy of nature, and two spots. So I think you, or some of you, have read these paragraphs. So we have the paragraph 248 and then the paragraph 250 where this idea appears. And we can see already in this one that we have here that he says that is an unsolved contradiction, which I'm saying is an important thing to consider. And also this is a very famous passage because Hegel says that nature is kind of the ways to Abfall can have different meanings, but let's say like one of the immediate one or the most like the everyday life understanding of Abfall will be to think of garbage. So that's why it's a very famous passage, because then people think about philosophy of nature and like, I don't know, in Schelling, like nature is the most important ontological entity. Well, it's not an entity, process. And in the case of Hegel, well, you have this phrasing of kind of being the non-existence, the waste of the idea. So one of the big conflicts in the recovery of Hegel's philosophy of nature is to discuss whether Hegel actually thinks of anything good about philosophy about nature, or it's just like this surplus of the idea. And I think like approaching to this idea of the contradiction in nature, help to give a better place to nature, so to speak. And that's part of the project here. And maybe we look at the second passage just to have them in mind, and we can go back. And as I was saying, at any point, if you want to intervene and ask anything in particular, I don't have the answers of everything, but we can discuss it now. And then, so the other passage, just to have it in mind. So in this one, I think the important thing is also to distinguish maybe, I don't know if you realize that in the other one, so nature, nature is the one that is said that is the contradiction. And then in the second one is the contradiction of the idea. And the contradiction of the idea is nature. So just to have this distinction in mind between the two passages. And so we saw in the first one that it is clear that it kind of so the problem with the discussion around these passages is precisely to know or to understand why one of them is about nature and the other one is about the idea. So I don't want to go into the details of the Hegelian discussion unless you want to, but just that you know that I say that is one of the problems. So I'm not ignoring the fact that one of the passages is about the idea and the other about nature. So that's all I want to say. And then in this, so I think that the second one is clear that it's so it poses this distinction or this opposition between necessity and contingency. And maybe just to have a bit more of context, so I just wanted to place you so in the idea of the contradiction. So I was saying, like, the first part of the system is the science of logic, the science of logic or the logic, and then in the logic, Hegel defines contradiction, and then this happens in precisely this part of the book, and I just wanted to situate you, and because I told you, like, in the logic we get a kind of contradiction that is solved, so that is kind of an important thing to consider, and maybe just for very general thinking about Hegel's idea of contradiction. So one thing is that contradiction is supposed to be ontological. So I don't know if you remember in the quote, but he says that nature is a contradiction. And this is a very, like, it's important in terms of contemporary discourse. And so he's not saying, like, how we judge about nature is contradictory. So it may be that we are making a mistake. It has to be with our being subjective or whatever, but it's nature itself, the one that is contradictory. So it's an ontological status of nature. And then the other thing that I thought may be important for the general framework about contradictions. So the point about contradictions in Hegel is that they are not contradiction between two sentences, let's say, like the affirmative and the negative, so A and non-A, but they are kind of contradictions of second order. So A must be contradictory, and then non-A must be contradictory too, and then we get kind of a contradiction of these two contradictions. So it's kind of, that's why I was saying kind of second order contradiction. And how I understand then, so although we shouldn't think in like terms of being sentences or judgments we do about nature, but just to have in mind like kind of what these two passages say, we could translate them like this. So nature is necessary and nature is contingent. So nature is, we can also translate that into nature is conceptually determined and nature is not conceptually determined. And so this means basically only that on the one hand, so nature is conceptually structured because it's, so that's part of the idealist project. So everything is conceptually structured. That's the idealist thesis or the absolute idealist thesis. Everything we can think of must be conceptually structured. Otherwise we cannot think of it. So in a sense, nature must have also a conceptual structure. Otherwise we couldn't think of nature. And then on the other hand, So for nature, that's the contradictory part. So it's conceptually structured, and at the same time it's not, and that's where kind of the door to contingency opens up. So for example, if we think of so if we want one example, in nature we find like the laws of physics that you would say those are necessary, but that certain objects fall into these laws, that this absolutely contingent. So I don't know, we have for example, if we think of objects falling, so the particular object that falls, that doesn't require any kind of necessity, and that's kind of the Hegelian problem with nature, and that's where also the contingency enters into the picture, and it's hard to get explained if you're thinking. So if you're saying everything we can conceive of must be conceptual, and you have some particular phenomena that are conceived of, but they seem not to follow the structure of necessity of the concept, and what are they? And that's kind of where the conflict enters. And so this is where I think that this distinction between the contradiction being in nature or the contradiction of the idea is important, because nature is conceived as the other of the idea, but not because it's beyond ideality, but because it is not recognized as ideality. So kind of nature is only relative to itself. So if you think in like this absolute relativity terms, and then we think of so relativity being the opposed to the absolute, and then we have for example, the relativity of nature would be that nature cannot think of itself unless it is in the form of minded subjects. So, for example, the relation between a tree and an ant, it's not conceptual for the ant or for the tree, but that doesn't mean that there are relations between an ant and a tree that can be conceptually conceived. So that's the relativity of nature for nature. And that in that sense, nature can only become absolute in relation to thought. So only when we think, when we judge about natural phenomena, then we transform nature in something absolute. So we transform nature in concepts, and a kind of the conceptual structure of nature becomes visible. But that's only in relation to our conceiving of it. But then the problem is kind of ideality. Ideality must be real in nature if it's supposed to be real. So it's that we cannot think that we project ideality into nature when we judge about it, because that will mean that so nature in itself has no conceptual structure, and we have said everything we can conceive of must have some kind of conceptual structure. So if we are posing this conceptual structure in nature, then it means it has no conceptual structure until subjects, minded subjects, put it in nature. And that's so that's we cannot think that that's ideality is kind of only potentially in nature. So in a sense, it must be really there. And this is the contradiction. So in a sense, nature has ideality, and in the other sense, it has not. It is not ideality. So that's the contradiction. I hope that this is making sense. If not, we can also stop here and discuss it. But I think like with this opposition of relativity and absolute, maybe it's more clear. Like I was saying, so when nature is only relative to itself, so when it has no relation to conceptual structures, like conceptual structures given by minded subjects, it's only relative to itself because it cannot conceive of itself. So as I was saying, a tree is not making any conceptual relations of its relation to the rest of the environment. That would be the not having the conceptual structure in itself. So when nature is thought, it is transformed into something that it is not. It's transformed into thought. And this is a circumstance that nature cannot do anything about it. So this is what Hegel calls the powerless of nature in this passage that we had. So nature is powerless in the face of spirit. When nature is thought, it is always determined by others. So it's determined by spirit. However, this does not mean that nature is made by thinking beings, because as what we're saying, it's not like we produce things when we think about them, or that we produce the ideality when we conceptualize nature. But when we cognize nature, it always appears to us in the form of a concept. But in order for us to recognize nature, or to cognize about nature, we must first be able to think of it as something independent. So we have to assume that nature is something in itself before we think about it, but we can only think about nature as always thought by us. That's kind of the problem. And this thinking about the independence of nature is we have to assume that nature is conceptually structured even before we have make any judgment about it. But this is we have to assume it. Because we only have mediated access to nature via our concepts. So we understand the independence of nature always from the perspective of our thinking, and we can only formulate the thesis of the necessary independence of nature from the perspective of our conceptual thinking. This is why Hegel says that nature is the idea in the form of otherness, and this was also in this quote. From the perspective of the conceptual approach to reality, a reality is conceived that is not determined by the concept. However, this is a state of cognizing nature and not our everyday experience of individual natural phenomena. So maybe like the last Hegelian quote. So this is a quote from a not very famous text, and I think I told you that we didn't need to read it for the session today, because it's not very. I don't even know if it's translated into English, but it's a collection also of notes from Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of nature, but this time from 1819-20. So it's not part of what it was published under the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences. So it's not part of, let's say, the text of the other two quotes. But I think it's a very clear text. If one can say that Hegel is clear at any point, but it kind of makes clear the point that nature can only be thought in this negative form. So maybe I read it and then I tell you why. Nature is a negative of its idea, the non-ideal subjective. It is itself the external. If there were no spirit, it will still be what it is. It is for itself. Or the determination of externality is a determination external to it in comparison with spirit. The essence of nature itself has nothing to do with externality. Against nature, the spirit is something external. Against the spirit, it is something else. It is the relative in the idea in general. In nature, everything is mutually exclusive. And what I thought that is so important about this passage is precisely like in these readings about the waste, nature being the waste of the idea, is that it's kind of assumed that therefore nature has no existence in itself, because we only conceive of nature conceptually, so kind of the existence of nature is dependent on us. This can be in many different senses. Of course, it can be meant in like subjective idealist sense, so that we really, when we conceive, we make nature. But I don't think that this is the sense in which you do not have to do that hard case to say this, but you can also say that nature is not differentiated until we think about it. So, for example, that a tree is not a tree, but just like a conglomerate of some molecules. And when we think about a tree as an entity, a complete entity, so we subjects, minded subjects, think about the tree, we transform this bunch of molecules into a tree. And otherwise, when nature is nature without us, it has no different, so the organisms are not different from each other. It's just kind of a mass of continuity of space. And what we do when we think is that we produce, so we individuate the natural phenomena, and we kind of produce difference in the natural world. So that's one form to say that nature is dependent on our conceptualization of it. And I think what this passage is doing is saying, so nature is in itself. Nature does not require that we think of it to be something or to be the particular things that it is. And that's why it also says, like, of course, that nature is external to spirit, but on the other hand, spirit is external to nature. So I think that with this passage, what I think that you can say that it's here is Hegel is kind of saying, so you don't only kind of postulate that nature is in itself, or that it has to be something independent of mind and subjects, but it is that, but you have to find it always via your concepts. So it's not a Kantian regulative principle idea that you kind of have to assume that there is a nature independent of us, but nature has to be independent of us. It makes no sense that it's otherwise, but we can only know this from the perspective of our conceptual schemes. So we can only know this by thinking, and that's a problem. So we always get access to the independence of nature by making it something else. That was this idea of nature is always transformed into different from what it is when we think about it. And part of this transformation has to do with nature is an autonomous field, and we make it something dependent of on our conceptual schemes and judgments. So I hope this idea makes sense. So what I think that this passage kind of shifts many readings of Hegel, because it's going against the idea that so conceptual mediation equals individuation or differentiation in nature. So maybe the questions that are like around this reading. So what does it mean that we recognize nature without simply projecting our subjectivity into it? So that's kind of what I was trying to explain. And if we simply project our subjectivity into it, we will never be able to recognize nature. That's kind of the thesis behind it. So if we will think of nature, that nature is that what we posit with our conceptual schemes, that will mean that we don't know about nature. We only know about our conceptual schemes or how we think about nature. And this other reading, what it's saying, that you can actually understand what nature is, because having concepts doesn't mean that you transform. So you transform the thing into something different, but then the thing becomes that, which it was transformed into. Okay, so much for Hegel now. Maybe if we want to come back to the quotes later in the discussion, we can do that. But I think like that's already kind of the core of the discussion. So what I was trying to explain with the relativity and the absolute, that's where this idea of absolute difference comes from. So let's say that if we assume that nature has to be something independent in itself and independent of our conceptions of it and of our subjective projection of concepts into nature, then we have kind of three fields. We have the field of nature as it is without us having to think about it. And then we have the field of our conceptual schemes and that which we use to understand the world and map the world with concepts. And then we have the field of what results of our production of judgments of the natural world. And if we will have, let's say, only nature by itself, as we were saying, it could not reflect on itself. So we have already kind of a difference because, so in my reading, I'm trying to say that Hegel thinks that nature is differentiated before we think about it. But this is kind of a first order differentiation. So it's different from, so organisms are different from each other, but this is just like the first level of difference. And then we have the kind of the second level of difference, which is nature as it's transformed by our thinking about it into concepts. So that's what it was the quote, like it's transformed into something different than it is. And then we have the level of spirit. So spirit is kind of the absolute difference, because it's the difference between so nature as it is differentiated only by itself, and it's the difference between spirit and nature. And that is what I'm trying to call absolute difference. So it's like the status of spirit when it differentiates itself from the natural difference. And this is kind of the idea that I want to transport into the discussion of Utopia. When we were reading the Galloway quote, one of the problems with the left is like how they conceive of the locality of utopia. So where does utopia happen? Is this material, or is this ideal? Is this at the space of the logos, or is this in the space of embodiment, let's say? And in this context is where I thought that it makes sense to think of how we conceive of the relation between, let's say, universality and particularity. And as you remember, Galloway also was discussing this assumption from the left that abstraction is bad in itself. So I think that's kind of where I thought maybe we want to think a bit with Gilmore. So how would we think about the locality of justice on injustice? And I got very interested by Gilmore's concept of justice as something that is embodied. And it seemed to kind of correspond to this idea of that is being criticized by Galloway. So it seemed that Gilmore is precisely this kind of the left that is being referred to in the quote. And I wanted to think if that means that makes kind of impossible to think utopia with Gilmore, and it stays at this level of the bloody or the materiality or the pure present, or kind of this justice that is never achieved. And then so the core of this critique, and I think you also got this to read the text of Gilmore. So the core of Gilmore's critique to how racism operates is precisely because racism is an operation of abstraction. So it's kind of a kind of violence that results from the institutionalization of abstraction. And it also abstracts embodied practices and brings together power and difference by distributing hierarchies across geographical spaces. So that's where the idea of a geographical evolutionism comes from. So geographical spaces are here not to be understood as a matter of national borders, but rather of the creation of and distribution of spaces. So Gilmore proposes to think of the struggle for justice as something embodied, and embodied in this sense, not yet in the sense of national borders, although the question is how the border gets also embodied. But then, so embodiment is kind of seems to be opposed to the politics of space that kind of disentangles a particular bodily experience from the occupation of an abstract geographical space. So let's say we have the order of the universality, of the abstraction of the geographical space in the national geography, in the national border. And then we have kind of the spatiality of the body or the embodied experience. So that seems to be kind of the problem. So when the embodied experience is transported or transformed into this abstraction of the national border. So I think this is something that we can get here. So I'm just gonna first read the quote. A violence of abstraction produces all kinds of fetishes, states, races, normative views of how people fit into make places in the world. A geographical imperative lies at the heart of every struggle for social justice. If justice is embodied, it is then therefore always spatial, which is to say part of a process of making a place. So justice, as we see, is characterized as this kind of notion of spatiality that does not coincide with the notion of abstraction of states and races. So I think that what Gilmore does, and it's very interesting for rethinking about or rethinking space, is to kind of decouple space from the abstraction of space into something as the border or the national border or the geographical border. And so the difference produced by and with abstraction is fatal, according to Gilmore, if it is coupled with a distribution of geographies driven by the power of a sovereign. And the power of the sovereign is kind of this figure of abstraction. We'll see how it works in a second. And this, I think this is the one discussed by Gilmore. But I don't think that Gilmore seeks to erase difference, because it obviously Gilmore thinks about like the difference between different forms of experience and embodied experience, but it's more like about changing the way in which it is produced from the transcendent perspective. And then I got another passage where I think that this can be seen. So racism is a practice of abstraction, a dealing displacement of difference into hierarchies that organize relations within and between the planet's sovereign political territories. Racism functions as a limiting force that pushes disproportionate cost of participating in an increasingly monetized and profit-driven world onto those who, due to the frictions of political distance, cannot reach the variable levers of power that which relieve them of those costs. So locality seems to be opposed to universality when the universal is made a transcendent field above above and beyond all. Its universality is gained by ruling over a multiplicity of entities. So locality, on the other hand, names the condition of each of the particulars. And the conditions are multiple because they depend on the particular entity. Thus, the universalism against which a critique of the abstract form of power is directed is the first one. So it's the transcendent form of universalism. The universalism that transcends its multiple instantiations. What also in Gilmore language is the power of the sovereign. So this kind of universality, the one that is transcendent, the power of the sovereign, is the one that creates the overdetermination of race, gender, class, and power. So I think this is also important because in this sense, Gilmore speaks of essentialism. For example, when Gilmore says, if race has no essence, racism does. So the essentialism comes from this being coupled to the transcendence of the universality. And it seems like the only way to work against this kind of domination over everyone will imply an opposition. So if we have this domination from the transcendence of universality, so it seems like the solution or like the form to go against it is to affirm each one of the particulars. So each one of the localities or the embodied experience. And what I would like to work through, or like kind of the problem I'm dealing with, is if we can think of different forms of understanding universality and locality, and maybe like how this reshapes the question of where utopia happens. So if we think of kind of a transcendent utopia, so something that is beyond the embodied experience, so in a sense, that will be this opposition that we had with Galloway. So that utopia is that which cannot be achieved, that kind of is at the core of the idea of utopia. But if you think of utopia more like in the terms of Gilmore, so it's something that kind of happens in the embodied experience. And you don't equate embodied experience with each one of the localities that exist, but the embodied experience is the realization of justice, as here in this example, with justice is embodied. So you don't have to think of justice that will come at some point in the future, which was one of the elements of the opposition in Galloway, but it's more like every time that justice is realized in its absolute form. So it doesn't need to kind of, it doesn't need to remain like something on the horizon in the future, but it's realized in the particular form of the embodied justice. So I think that this could be like a good way to consider Galloway's provocation concerning the thought of utopia in the left. So if the embodiment of struggle, maybe the embodiment of struggle is not opposed to this striving towards utopia. So if we think like justice is not something we have to wait to come, but it may be instantiated in some forms of present. So I think like the general idea or the problem I'm dealing with is like how to question this dichotomy between the materiality of the forms in which nature strives to be what it is, or the materiality of the particular organisms, or that we discussed last time, and then kind of the possibility of radical transformation. And if we think that utopia must be thought as absolute difference, that is, as the difference that emerges from the differentiation of nature through its aims and from the differentiation of human thought through thought, I think that that would be like the core of this rethinking the spatiality of utopia. So utopia can only emerge by material configurations, but it also cannot be remaining pure idea. That's kind of the answer to the problem. This could be like kind of duality that Galloway identified in the left, but rather is a space opened up by our thinking of a given material situation. And in this sense, the embodiment of justice is precisely a thought about that, how utopia is realized in the present, what I was just trying to say in a minute. So how it precisely does not become an ideal beyond the particulars that cannot be achieved. In a sense, utopia must somehow happen in the present and not happen. It happens when justice gets embodied. Every particular instantiation of the utopian moment is utopia. On the other hand, it remains as the aim for further development, as that which we strive for. But what is on the other side, so to speak, is not given because there is no metaphysical superentity determining the aim. So for utopia to remain what it is, it must be given by the particular constraints of the present situation. And this is where the thought about like the constraints of nature becomes relevant, by the particular situation in which does not completely instantiate it. So on the one hand, I think that of the locality of ideality differently, so that it does not get coupled in the dangerous form Gilmore's points to. So it's not the couple of abstraction and hierarchy, but also kind of we need to rethink the locality not in terms of just one particular. And I think like the core of the idea is basically to say that we do not think to assume that there is kind of a transcendent moment of utopia, but rather that it can be realized absolutely in the present. And it's more like the question of the continuity and discontinuity of this realization. So we could say like there are moments of discontinuity where like the realization gets interrupted, and then there are moments where it is realized fully. So when justice is embodied, as Gilmore says. And maybe just to end with like kind of how I imagine that this happens, I can also close with a quote by Lewin, and we can also talk about it in a minute. So then Lewin says, I have no idea who will be there. Who will be there? I think that I have missed something on the quote, what it may be like on the other side. So I believe there are people there. They have always lived there. There are songs they sing there. One of the songs is called Dancing at the Edge of the World. And maybe I stop here and we can come back to Hegel and discuss how this materiality of nature or non-materiality works. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, do you want to go back to questions? Hegel, There is one already from Cosmos. In more modern language, can we think of spirit as agency or artificiality? I don't know if you'd like to elaborate on that.
Yes, so I can say something about it. So actually, my interest on this idea of teleology in the contemporary philosophy of biology and contemporary biology is precisely on this idea of agency. So, like, if we have organisms that put their own aims and they strive for their own aims that they have given themselves, that is this idea of like becoming an agent or becoming an autonomous agent. But I think less of so the equation between agency and subjectivity. I think more of the equation between agency and subjectivity, and that is kind of the precondition for spirit. So spirit, let's say, it's a particular form of an agent. So you have, let's say, any kind of organism can be an agent, and it can be the carrier of subjectivity, but then like minded subjects becomes a different kind of agency. So it's one that can reflect on themselves and can also like decide over aims beyond those that are posed by the material situation. And that's where ideality becomes also very relevant. But yeah, I would say that that agency is kind of the precondition for something as a spirit, and we could think more of it in terms of subjectivity. And I think one of the misconceptions of many ideas in idealism in general is precisely to understand what they say when they say subjectivity. And that many think of a kind of a translation into modern terms will imply that when we think about subjectivity, we speak of minded subjects. But I think like many uses of subjectivity in Hegelian language refer more to this notion of agency, of productivity. So yeah, I hope that goes into the direction of the question.
Okay, thank you. There's another question from Hamid. How does Hegel's definition of nature as a contradiction contribute to our understanding of what distinguishes humans from other natural things? Is it solely our capacity for thought and reflection, or are there other aspects at play?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think, so in Hegelian terms, maybe there are two things that Hegel would name, but they are kind of related. So yes, on the one hand is like capacity to think, but I think that Hegel actually formulated, I think this is at the beginning of the encyclopedias and the general remarks in the encyclopedia, formulated in terms of religion. And so Hegel says like that what distinguishes humans from other natural beings, from animals actually, is that they are religious beings. But I think that, of course, we can also kind of try to translate this, and it's not like they have any given system of religious beliefs, which may actually be a Schellingian point. So I think that Schelling actually wants to distinguish like humans because they construct like mythologies and systems of beliefs in that sense. But I think how I read Hegel's claim that it's religion is that they have this capacity to reflect on their own ideality, so to speak, so that they can understand they are kind of part of idea of part of this of an ideal world. Ideal not in the sense of something that we wish for, but in the sense of something that is conceptually structured, and that humans can have the capacity to reflect or to understand that they are part of a conceptually structured world, so to speak. And that's how I read this claim that so what distinguishes humans is like religion, And as I was saying, like in Schelling, it will imply religion in the sense of, and the many mythologies around the world. But I think like in Hegel is more like about this capacity to reflect on your own situation as a conceptual subject in a conceptual world, so to speak.
Thank you. There's a comment from Simon. Thank you, Anna. Considering language as an elusive and complex phenomenon, much like a black box with unpredictable inputs and outputs, how can the functions of language reveal the inherent power it holds? Additionally, does deciphering or breaking down the complex codes of human language pose a risk of self-destruction or fundamental alteration of its essence?
Wow, that's a complex question. I don't know if I have the right answer for it. So I don't know. I don't think much in terms of language, but maybe, so I don't know if you want to speak and maybe tell me a bit more about like this idea of language being a black box. But maybe if you cannot speak, that's also okay. Want to unmute?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Language like a black box, yes. Because there is a different and variable input and output, and maybe we can't understand main meaning word, you know. And it's my idea. It's my question about it's in black box and black book. Aside, it's interesting for me, and reading that, and I have two questions about one question about language is a black box, and there is many code in a language. And other question about black book and about palicity, I think. And what is black book in palicity? About its essay.
So I'm not sure I have much to say because I don't think much about like language in those terms. But I guess so you are thinking of kind of a system of receiving and then decoding like the message that you receive, maybe in that sense. But I wonder, so the question is like, if we understand how this works, whether that will like imply to I don't know, like a kind of self-destruction of the human. And I don't see why, because I think that we do this many times. So I'm not sure like, hey, we'll have an answer for this. I'm just like intuitively answering. But I think like we do this many times. So we try all the time to understand how language works. That precisely like, I don't know, when people try to understand how natural language for like natural language processing works. So I don't think that this implies kind of a destruction of humanity, but it's more like, well, maybe we develop new ideas of how to develop humanity in different ways. So maybe like if we understand better how language works, that may be something that help us to like have new avenues for, you know, I don't know, like maybe to understand others, to understand ourselves. So to me, actually, it looks like it has more potential than destructive potential. But yeah, maybe I'm too optimistic. But that's not a Hegelian answer to anything. I don't know if Hegel will say that language is a black box, although he thinks weird things about like science, like so his idea of a medium. It's kind of so science. I'm saying this word because I never pronounce it in the right way. Is is kind of a neutral medium, and that's why it can carry a meaning. But I'm unsure that he would say that that's why it's kind of like, yeah, this closed system. Yeah, so much for what I have to say. Yeah.
There's a question from Devin. I don't know if you'd like to speak, but if not, I can read it. It says, I think there is an important connection between language and conceptualization that perhaps mediates the very structures of what utopias may be possible and how nature is conceptualized.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to say something about it, Devin? But I guess that was a bit what I was trying to say in my comment to the other question, that for me, that it seems that, yeah, that's okay. So it seems to me that it has more potential that's any destructive character. So if we can understand better how we communicate or how we relate to others, that to me has to like kind of a potential for, I don't know, possible resistance for justice, like struggles for justice. So kind of that will be kind of a possible diagnosis of what happens when people don't understand each other. But that's not enough. But let's say it will have like some affirmative, positive potential. So maybe, yeah, I was thinking precisely about this kind of potential when I answered to the other question.
There's a question from Daniel. If you'd like to speak, you may. If not, I can read. How could we understand the definition of nature for Hegel in terms of the Anthropocene era?
So I don't know if I have thought much about it, but I heard people talking about this, like trying to translate Hegel's concept of nature into kind of Anthropocene thoughts. And I think one direction is precisely to think of this. So we have transformed nature since a long time as kind of how our conceptual transformation gets materialized in what nature can become or becomes. So this idea of so Anthropocene as being this period where humans have changed what nature is. So that will be like a very Hegelian take on it. So yeah, humans like transform nature. And as I was trying to say, like that doesn't mean that they make nature, or that because we think about it and appears nature in the world, but that there is like kind of a deep transformation of what nature is because we conceptualize it in a determinate way, for example, as a resource, an infinite resource for whatever. And like this idea of nature, so it drives how we behave towards nature, and then it also kind of determines what nature can be or can become. And I was thinking, so when of the at the beginning of the philosophy of nature, and I think this is in the remarks, and I told you not to read the remarks, but that there is this idea of different attitudes that we have towards nature, and then there is kind of the practical and the theoretical attitude. And I think in the practical attitude, Hegel says that there is this so this looking at nature as kind of a medium and not an aim. So it's kind of only something that we use for something else. But he kind of says like, yeah, and that probably is a problematic thinking of nature. And that's why the theoretical thinking of nature can help us to see nature as it is, and not only when we see nature as a medium for something else. So maybe in that those are for me like compatible thoughts with this idea of how we conceive of nature, like drives how we behave towards nature, and that may be like had implications for how for how nature is let's say transformed, and now not only in this metaphorical sense of transform when it's transforming the concepts, but it like when it's transforming the concepts, then we do things with nature because we think that it is in a certain way. So maybe that may be a form to kind of shape some things about this around this concept of nature in Hegel and the Anthropocene. But I will say that Hegel could think absolutely like with this idea, like the concept of the Anthropocene, like it's very, it is not so far away from what he's trying to say. Yeah.
I am going to ask another Hegel question before getting into these next questions, which are more Galloway, Gilmore. Just as a basic question, so there's the contradiction of nature in the paragraph 248, which is necessary and contingent, and then there's the contradiction in 250, that's the idea of nature. The idea that the idea, I mean, so is nature impotent, and then the idea of nature preserving itself through abstraction? I was thinking of that the natural contradiction as like external, as a relation between individuals, and then the contradiction of the idea of nature is not so much internal, but it's also not individuals. But then these later lecture notes that you introduce, I realize I don't understand what he's trying to say. So I guess one way of asking a question was like, is in 250, what is the impotence? Is that the impotence of nature, or is that the impotence of the idea of nature?
Mm-hmm.
And then how does that relate to this like later idea of externality?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in a sense, I also, when I read this lecture, I was also like, I don't understand anymore. Like, I thought that I understood when I was like reading the philosophy of nature. And I think that really it changed for me, like how I understand Hegel's concept of nature. And I think in a sense, because I understood first that nature is powerless in this sense that it's always determined by subjects, and then it seems like the powerlessness come because it does not transform itself. So I think I don't know if this is in this paragraph, but there is this concept of so transformation in sense of in the sense of transforming like its form, like literally, and then so what I thought first when I only had the philosophy of nature here is that powerlessness means nature is not capable of transforming itself, so it would be like kind of the opposite of what the Schellingian philosophy of nature will say, because in a Schellingian philosophy of nature is this pure productivity, like creating and recreating itself all the time, and like so Hegel will have the kind of the opposed to that, and then you have this nature that is just like inert matter, and that can only be like ordered, differentiated, etc. when we conceptualize it. That would be like one possible reading. And then like the powerlessness means only like so nature is not productive, and that's also why it gets defined as waste. So this Abfall, because it's like compared to the productivity of the conceptual, it's like it's this garbage, so to speak. That's kind of one reading of these two paragraphs. And then when I introduced the other when I introduced the other quote, what for me became kind of a possible reading is to say that the powerlessness is not because nature is like kind of nothing in itself, because Hegel literally says it is something by itself when we are not thinking about it. But what it makes its powerlessness, I don't know if the word in English is correct, but powerless is that it cannot do anything when we think about it and transform nature into concepts. So that's so it's not because in itself does not produce anything, because it's producing itself all the time as it produces organisms and they relate to each other, and kind of it's productivity. So there is productivity in nature against what almost all readings of Hegel will say, and precisely like Schellingian readings of Hegel will say, or Schelling would say about Hegel. But where it becomes powerless is like towards our thinking of it, because when we think it, we transform it into something that nature is not. And so nature is not abstraction, nature is not concepts, nature is not judgments about nature. And that's where it cannot do anything against it. So that's kind of how I try to read these passages in light of this other passage when Hegel says, well, nature is something in itself. And against nature, spirit will also be external. So that's, so let's say if nature could think, what nature cannot do, unless it's in the form of human beings, will also make us make spirit external, but that's something that nature cannot do. So I hope that that maps out what I want to do with this quote. But as I was saying, when I found this lecture, I also thought like this changes like everything. Like this changes like a lot of readings of these passages on the upfall, on the waste. I don't know what is a good word for this. Also because in German it has a bit this idea of decay because it falls. So up fall has the idea of now I'm thinking of German, the idea of falling. So it kind of decays. It's the decay of the idea, and it really sounds like you don't need it. But then in the other passage in the lecture of 1819, it sounds as so it is as important as spirit because we are in relation, like relative to nature, we are the external. I hope that kind of maps something of it. But yeah, so I'm trying to reread those passages in this way. So saying it's not because it's not productive. Nature is productive. The only problem is that nature is not capable of conceptualize itself. And as I was saying, like importantly, we are nature. That this is also something that I think they've never mentioned, like that Hegel says that like the highest form of nature is life, because life is the minimal condition for minded subjects to appear. So in a sense, Hegel knows that we are part of nature, but life kind of solves the contradiction. If ever this contradiction gets a unified form, is in the form of minded subjects, because it's a part of it's life that can actually do that, conceive of its own, reflect on its own conditions, so to speak.
Thank you, Helios Singh Batra. If your question is in regards to Hegel, you can ask that now. There were a couple others in the chat as well.
Yeah, it was about the first, like, thank you, Anna, and hello. Like, we met like ages ago in Bonn. Nice to see you again. I don't know if you remember, but hey. Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I just wanted to like offer a possible kind of contrary reading of Hegel's idea of the externality of nature and also the weakness of nature, and which also points to maybe a shift between what we find in the Encyclopedia and in the 1820 notes, right? Because in the 1820 notes, he's saying that like nature, externality does not have to do with nature itself. Externality has to do with nature's relation to spirit. So nature as external to spirit. But it seems like in the Encyclopedia, he is saying that nature is external in itself, right? It is external to itself, right? Like, and I think, you know, this is very evocative kind of image that he brings up, which is which has to do with something about how you can't like board up nature. Like as far as you go into the cosmos, there will always be like somewhere further to go. So there's this sense in which like nature itself is this constant process of self-externalization, where like every point already points beyond itself to and outside to something external to it. And yeah, I mean, you know, we can read that as a kind of productivity, even though it's like maybe different from like the organic kind of productivity that you find in Schelling. But yeah, but then like and I guess kind of related to that, this idea of the weakness of nature, it seems like for Hegel, I mean, I don't know. I think one of the central contradictions for me personally, the way I read Hegel's philosophy of nature, has to do with this idea that on one hand, nature is bereft of the concept, but on the other hand, the concept seems to permeate nature. Like in the sense where there are real quasi-mind independent concepts that are somehow like, within nature, right? And it seems like what he points to with this idea of the weakness of nature is the fact that on one hand, nature contains within itself these like law-like universals, and on the other hand, every product that emerges out of this process of self-externalization is constantly falling short of the uniformity, the universality, the regularity of the concept, right? Like so it's not so much that like nature is deficient or defective with respect to the way we conceptualize it, but more to do with the fact that like nature in itself posits these laws, but it is failing to live up to its own laws, right? Like but yeah, like I just offering that as like a perspective, and wondering what you think. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's amazing. So I think, so one thing that I find a bit not that attractive of the idea of nature kind of expanded always beyond itself is that it kind of transformed the nature in so this field of continuity, pure continuity, so to speak. So it will have to be imagined. So I think of this. So when we say like, yeah, I think you're right in saying like, yeah, nature posits like some kind of so norms for itself and then break it. And for me, that is the sense in which it becomes external, so to speak. But the other one will mean for me that the nature it becomes only this like continuum, like it's just like a continuity of, let's say, of space, of the development. So it kind of, yeah, it kind of always like unfolds itself further. But I think like it may be the case that that's part of what nature is, but it's also when, like, for example, particular organisms unfold beyond that which they are supposed to be because they are searching for a kind of an ideal aim, they have posit themselves. That is also kind of this expansion and going beyond itself. And so for me, that means that it's more like the particular instantiations of the general laws, so to say, that the nature posits itself is that which is like expanded beyond itself. But probably I'm misunderstanding what you were saying with this expansion, and probably you were saying exactly the same. But to me, it sounded a bit like we have kind of a register of what nature is, and this is like the totality of nature now, and then it kind of expands beyond this totality. And so what I want to try, or what I was trying to make stronger is the case that also like the particulars are kind of external to themselves. So each one of those natural phenomena expand beyond the self-given rule. And maybe I thought like one thing that also never came up in the talk was this difference between being external determined and internal determined, which is also very important to understand organisms as agents or as self-agents, so that they give aims by themselves. That means they are not like determined by external laws. And kind of the problem with nature is that it kind of, on the one hand, is determined by external laws, and on the other hand, is determined by laws that it gives itself. And probably where I see this kind of by external laws is that nature is determined sometimes by pure contingency and sometimes by pure necessity. And this is the quote also when he says like, I think I didn't put this quote in the slides, but in these passages, he also says like, nature is contingent and necessary, but it's never free. And I think nature is precisely never free because it's always externally determined, either by pure contingency or by pure necessity. And that's for me what makes like kind of the external aspect of nature. So sometimes it kind of is determined by pure contingency when the particulars are like driving the movement of nature, but sometimes by pure necessity when it's like a pure conceptual frame. So that what we will say like natural laws, for example. But in any case, it's always determined by an external movement, and that's kind of where nature becomes determined by other than itself, so external to spirit, for example. But on the other hand, in a sense, it's also internally determined. So when organisms give themselves constraints and do something because of those constraints, in a sense, they are also kind of internally determined, and that's a contradiction. So I think that that's precisely the moment of the contradiction. So in a sense, they are always kind of maybe that's actually like these are the two levels of the contradiction. So one of them, what I was saying in the two quotes, so one of them is the contradiction in nature, and the other is the contradiction of the idea that is nature. And probably that's the level of the two levels. So one of them is the contradiction between contingency and necessity, that is this external determination of nature. And then on the other hand is also this being externally determined and being internally determined at the same time. And that's what makes the contradiction of the level of the idea. But in a sense, I think like, so you're right at pointing that it has to do with this, with these norms that nature kind of gives itself. So that's what also in the quote is like this Gesetzsein. So making itself lawful, and lawful is in the sense of the laws of nature. But I will be a bit hesitant to think of this kind of the totality of nature expanded beyond nature, but maybe I misunderstood that part.
Yeah, I guess just really briefly add, like, I mean, I mostly agree with what you're saying, but I guess like like understand, like we only have to assume that the self-externalization of nature implies a kind of continuum of nature if we understand self-externalization or self-differentiation as a linear process instead of a kind of like diffractory, like, you know, instead of like one thing just like becomes like this one discrete other, like it might be splitting up into a whole bunch of other things. And like, I mean, I don't think Hegel, because these are all like just notes, right? Like, but like, so Hegel doesn't actually dwell that much on that thought. But like, you know, if we look at like, I guess, I don't know, I'm not a biologist, man, but like from the little bit that I understand from like a biological theory, we can understand like the evolution of organisms in a similar way, where you know, like it's not as if like let's say one lineage has to result in another thing in another thing. Like they can the tree can branch, so to speak. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, in that sense, I completely agree with you. So if that's the sense of expansion beyond itself, yes, that's it. Yeah, thank you for the questions.
Yeah, thank you. If anyone else has read those 1820, 1819, 1820 lecture notes, I'll ask also this question that just came in the chat from Hamid. How does Gilmore's criticism of abstraction and her emphasis on the embodiment of political struggle interact with or contradict Hegel's concept of the ideality of nature? And of course, we'll get back to those other questions in the chat, but this one seemed good to ask now.
Yeah, that's good, because that's hard. So I think what I'm trying to think is through this, like, so Gilmore is a Marxist at heart. And I think like that's why it kind of fits to the description of this critique that Galloway was doing. So that Marxists always are skeptical of abstraction. And what I was trying to say is that, so you can think of abstraction in terms of this transcendent field, so that what is beyond the particulars. And if we get this idea of nature is like both like kind of contingent and necessary, and we say, well, it's necessary because it has this conceptual scheme. So maybe we don't need to think of the conceptual as that what is beyond the particulars, and this is just like my reading of Hegel, but I'm not the only one, that you can think of concepts as being immanent to the particulars. And I think like in that sense, I think it's actually Gilles Mehra is compatible, and it's just, so there is no fight against, so the left is no fight against the abstraction in itself or logos and etc. But it's a fight against a precise idea of, or an understanding of abstraction as transcendence. But if you get the conceptual immanent to the particulars, so you don't have this problem. And what I'm trying to say is that when Gilles Mehra says justice is embodied, it kind of tries to bring justice, or like this abstract idea, to be like actually instantiated in each one of the particulars where justice happens. So it's something that happens in the particulars, and it's not an ideal to be realized at some point. So that's how I'm trying to say, like, so it's actually because of the Marxist school that it does not get into one of those transcendental ideals. I hope that makes sense. But as I said, that's kind of part of my exploratory part, because that's where I'm trying to think of this problem of universality, particularity, and then when you kind of make the universality immanent to the particularity, and how that could like help us to go through many of these debates about like, I don't know, like last time I was talking about, so this kind of locality of struggles that seems to be opposed to like universal claims. But as I say, that's kind of the big project, which is not ready, obviously.
And so what do you think as far as like in Galloway's analog philosophy is the status of continuity comes up there very much, but he's sort of he would criticize Gilles Mehra for staying with the bloody. I mean, do you think that this is a problem? I don't see how it's a problem. I mean, one thing that is really interested in me in the abolition geography in the essay right before the fatal coupling, there's a line about how the growth of the prisons in the USA is a function of politics and not mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, I mean, I think that Gilles Mehra, while having this Hegelian lineage there, is also raising questions inherent to organicism as far as that abstraction that's the reification of death, of life and death as a binary. But I mean, I don't mean to say like, are you on the side of Galloway or Gilles Mehra in this? But do you think that there is a argument between them there?
So of course, I'm not implying that Galloway refers directly to Gilles Mehra, and I don't think, he will be brave enough to do it. But I think that, so this very broad characterization of the left is what makes me skeptical, so to speak. So who is the left? And what I read from the passage and from this kind of opposition that he's putting on the passage is that he's arguing against kind of these embodiment positions. That's where like the bloody gets into the picture. Also, like I think last time I also talked about this distinction between the politics of space and the politics of presence in Galloway. So also in this book. And then, so he says like, kind of assumes that there is kind of a linear story happening between the politics of space, so it's kind of gone, and we now have this politics of presence. And I would think that that's what he's calling the left, so the politics of space. So that which is, so the positions such as, I don't know, the distribution of space and how bodies occupy space, And precisely like many of the abolitionist perspectives are coming from those kind of ideas. So like what kind of distribution of space. So because they are also like many of them have, I don't think that's specific in the case of Gilbert, but many of them are like related to ideas of the like a jail as a very specific setting of the distribution of space. So in a sense, I don't think that is a directly reference to this, but so it's kind of one of the many characterization of that position. I will say, like also last time we talked about many like techno-feminist perspectives, that many of them will also fit the description of this left. Not all of them, because actually Galloway refers to xenofeminism as kind of one that is more like working on this politics of presence. But I will say like something like glitch feminism probably will get, although it's like kind of framed as a digital politics, or like position for like the politics in the digital age, it will probably be one of the ones framed as kind of these embodied positions. So I think like there are many positions like implied there, but they are also not mentioned. That's also something that happens in the book. And that's why I get skeptical. And I think that's kind of the what people also sometimes call identity politics is what is kind of in the background of this idea of the left that cannot realize ideality of justice. Yeah. And I'm trying to avoid to answer the question, are you with Galloway or Guzmán? But I'm trying to say, not enemies, and maybe you don't have to be so skeptical of people talking about space. So maybe some people talking about space are thinking about like this immanence of the conceptual.
Thank you. Claire, if you'd like to speak and elaborate on this question in the chat.
Hello, Anna. Thanks for your talk. Yeah, I wanted you to maybe elaborate a little bit on how Utopia is more of a discrete process, from what I understood, and would be more like something digital and not analog.
Mm-hmm. And do you mean like what I think, or what I think that Galloway says? Or
both things.
Because I think like Galloway would say is kind of so it's kind of this digital because it works and does not work. So that's the deal. Like it kind of it's like sometimes gets off and on. So that probably is a discontinuous process. And I think probably because I told you at the beginning, I'm interested in Bloch's idea of utopia, and probably because of that, I will tend to think that actually it must be something continuous. So that's also like this cheesy quote at the end with Lewin, so that it must be something that kind of is here. So I think like for me, utopia can only be something that is actually always like realized. The problem is that it does not have the temporality of the present. So it does not have the form of being realized, meaning being here and now, but like, so things that are real in their possibility, in their being possible, so to speak. And in that sense, I would say kind of its continuity. If you push me to decide whether it's digital or analog, yeah. So I'm yeah. But that's just because of a bit of the Bloch context.
And Antoine, can you also elaborate on this question in the chat?
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. About so I understood that utopia is to be locally realized within the subject, and so is there maybe in the readings or in your own perspective a model so how we can like balance or expand on individual local utopias, so to make them connected, but as not to make them universal, but let's say as a wide system, or.
No, I really don't have one. I mean, if you ask me, I really don't have like the model for it, but I think like to describe it in a very nice way. So it's actually about connecting the forms in which utopia is realized now.
Yes.
and kind of expanding them.
But do you think it would it be the purpose of teleology if I follow all your like sector of thought? Because I feel that digitality, internet is actually exactly that. So you produce your own interface, you modelize it to output an utopia for yourself. But what we fail to do is to, let's say, back mirror this picture of the interface you produce for yourself to other people. And so you cannot be like intersubjective. You can always be like subjective onto yourself. And so maybe the question, could it be possible within teleology to expand as to fragment but multiply, but not to universalize? So we actually maybe don't propagate this kind of daring abstraction that you've described.
Yeah. You have all like so good questions. I think this is also really like deep thinking question, because so in a sense I would say that it kind of relates to the idea of teleology in the sense that this definition that we had last time with Stuart Kaufman, so that you have like the constraints, and so the living kind of always try to go beyond constraints, but for that you have to first work with your constraints. So in that sense, it kind of it's an internal process, but I'm not sure I would say it's an internal process to individuals, but probably an internal process to like systems. So like if we think also of organisms as systems, and then maybe like so like that's why also I think I also say that this if we think of utopia as the aim, and the aim is something that is self-given, but it's something that is self-given given the condition of the constraints in the present. So in a sense, yes, it's kind of the condition of life to try to go beyond the constraints, and like giving like itself aims of like this going beyond. But I will be unsure to think that that's a process that happens only like individually, but probably like, if we find the right way. So that's why like in the other question, it was like hard to say like if I have a method of connecting the different embodied utopias, but maybe like if we find a good way to kind of individuate the systems that can do this, maybe that's what we need to understand how to connect them. But that's what I don't have. So
yes, that's very
skeptical of the individual part, but I don't know like where will be like the right system to do it.
But that's very good. But how could we? It's not teaching, but how can we do that without abstracting the inner system perspective? How you do your utopia for yourself, but if you want to teach or slide it to the next individual, how can you actually do it without abstracting?
But probably the problem is not with abstraction, and maybe that was kind of my point with the Gilmore code. So the problem is not so much abstraction in itself, but when you couple abstraction with this like transcendent hierarchy. So like with being something that is beyond yourself. So if you follow external aims, let's say, that's the wrong part of abstraction.
I see it.
But if the aim self-imposed, then we are like in the form of abstraction we need. So it's abstraction in any case. But like when I say like transcendent, the problem with transcendent abstraction is that it's imposed. So it comes from the outside.
Yes.
And then the autonomy of the agency gets lost in that externality.
Okay. Yes.
But yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Here's another question in the chat from Hamid. In proposing utopia as a form of absolute difference, how do you reconcile the seemingly static nature of a utopian ideal with the dynamic, ever-changing process of dialectical transformation?
This is a great question. I think that this question gets me in trouble with this idea of the utopia is realized. Because then if I say this, then I will have to say that the form of the present of utopia is kind of a dynamic form, otherwise I'm stuck. So I guess I will go that way, but I don't know yet what will that concretely mean. But that, yeah, so probably I will have to say that that you don't have, so because utopia is realized now in the now, that doesn't mean that is everything that it can be, or that maybe that's where the connection of the different systems gets interesting. So maybe that's what it makes it's making it dynamic, because it's kind of a relation of different systems. Yeah, but I have to confess that this question will get me into trouble, and I have to think about it. Oh, I was about to make notes in my Hegel. Oh my God.
This question also inspires me to reread that Gambaretto essay, just because I wonder if you could bring in that a little bit now, or if that makes any sense to you, because is there a theory of biological theories that can be of use to an anti-colonial struggle?
Be used or be
of use? Be of use.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Like, I think that's kind of the norm. I would say that that's the normal program. So that's why it's kind of it's kind of daring to think that we can think with nature, because so kind of the core of the critique to essentialist idea of nature is precisely because of this, because they were used, instrumentalized to produce like precisely this wrong idea of abstraction, and to transcend ideas of what nature is supposed to be and normalize them. And so when we speak about naturalization, it's precisely this process. And I think that they will, so many ideas of nature have been used in this sense. And so big discussion is whether, for example, the idealists were in this game, although they are saying things that are against that precise idea, but they have so many affirmations that you will say, well, they are misusing their own conception. So I would say, like, it's a risky position, because very, very fast it gets into the wrong direction. So that's why, for me, like, the interesting thing would be to think what happened to nature after the critique to naturalization. So what kind of nature we got, and if there is any way to make sure that, well, they won't be misused. I don't think so, but I think like one very quick form to misuse is to transform aims in external aims. So to say, like, nature must be in this form, and then you have, like, so that kind of makes the transcendent of the aim, because then if it must always be in this form, it goes against the very idea of the self-giving constraints and self-producing your own aims of the organism. But you can say this, like, well, your idea of this organism is to be this and only this, and then it's gone. And then you are on this part of the naturalizing normativity essentialist idea. So I think, like, that's actually kind of the usual normal form to misuse nature, to say, like, that's how it's supposed to be. And so what I want to do is to say, like, but you can also, with this thing, like, this is how it could be, by like going the way of nature and not just negating nature. So it's not also like just saying, well, the only form to make sure that we are free is to just affirm spirit, because that's the only thing that at the end can be free. So you can affirm a certain degree of of freedom in nature in this sense of agency of the organism. And that's kind of how I want to rework it. But I will say, like, it's so easy to make the other way. Yeah. But I don't think also that that is necessary to make the essentialist argument when you're coming from nature. And I think that, so for example, people like Yukui has gone like into the criticism of nature by transforming nature into this naturalized field. And then everything that is kind of this, like the organism paradigm, let's say, it's related to this essentialist idea of nature. And I think that we should think about like how we will conceive nature as part of our program of emancipation, and that we do not need to just negate nature for that. But yeah, I would say like definitely that's a way to. There is thousands of ways to misuse nature, and we have seen them, all of them, maybe maybe all of them already.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak or ask a question or make a comment? Please, you're welcome to.
Thank you, Claire.
Yeah, if there are no more questions, then perhaps we'll close the session. Do you have any other comments or statements, Anna?
Thank you, everyone. Just like you read this text, you suffered with me. So thank you for joining and reading and commenting. Yeah, I really like learn a lot from the questions, and I'm gonna have a hard time with some of them. So thank you.